types of diffusion, and these osmosis is considered a type of diffusion, but it is a specific type involving the movement of water, specifically water that is separated from another body of water by some sort of membrane. And that membrane is such that it won't allow the particles that are dissolved, the solutes, to move, but the porosity, the pores are small enough that they will allow water to move. When I was growing up, there was this saying of if you can't bring Muhammad to the mountain, you bring the mountain to Muhammad. So, what we're looking at is that nature wants a balance. And if it can't move one thing, it will move another to reach that balance. Now, highly polar molecules like water, very small, pass easily through the plasma membrane. So, here's an example. Water molecules, relatively small, pass through that membrane. But if we want water to move faster, then we can actually put in a protein gate or protein channel, which is called an aquaporin. And we do this in cells of the, or in parts of the kidney where we want movement to occur faster. This process can actually generate a significant amount of pressure within the cell. If we have a whole lot of solutes in the cell and very few outside of the cell, water can move in. It can actually cause the cell to expand to a point where it can burst. So, this is significant in a couple of ways. You can actually overhydrate your body. There was a young lady a few years ago who was in a bladder burst contest, which basically was whoever pees last wins the car. She had to hold her hand on a car, and this was being promoted by something, I guess Dansani or some other water company. And as part of it, you had to drink like a liter of water an hour. Well, this young lady was very petite. She was small. Typically, your kidneys can take care of the water that you take in. It will make you need to pee. But in her case, she overwhelmed her system. And what happened was that the tissues in her body began to swell. One set of tissues has nowhere to go when it swells. So the brain started to expand. And she started having a headache, and then she passed out. And by the time the ambulance got to her, she was dead because her brain had swollen to the point it actually pushed the brain stem out of the foramen magnum of the skull. So this is actually a very powerful process. Now, facilitated diffusion requires a protein carrier. That is an appropriately sized and shaped door for stuff to pass through. So, if you think of the cell as being like a room, okay, there's stuff that can seep in and out of the room just through little gaps. Oxygen, air, other substances, smoke can pass in. But to get something really big, you need a doorway. So I've got a door in my room here that is of the appropriate size and shape to allow me to pass through. It also allows some other stuff to pass through, but it is too small to let me drive my car through. So it limits what's coming through that opening. This is good for transporting stuff that won't be dissolved in lipids, large substances that we just want to be able to pass through. So, let's take a look at how this might work. A lot of these protein channels are like gates. We can open and close them. Just like the door in my room, I can close it. I can keep anybody else from coming in. When I want somebody to come in, I just open the door. Once the door is open, it doesn't require any energy output from the cell itself to do this. It just happens. So we've got some that can be opened and closed, such as this. We've got others that are open all the time, and these just leak. You know, I think of it being kind of like those toys that you had when you were a kid. You've got square pegs, round holes. You can't put the square peg in the round hole. You have to get the ideal shape to be able to go through the opening. So there is some selection that can occur there. And this makes me think of that game show a few years ago. I think it was called Hole in the Wall, where people had to adopt a certain physical shape or pose as a wall approached them to be able to pass through that wall. Now, I've talked about pool a couple of times. This really doesn't have much to do with anything other than I think it's a cool video, so I'm going to show you this.
Oh my God.
Now, likelihood is something like that's not going to happen. Mostly we get a random motion. At least it's not going to happen when I do a pool break, because I don't have that much skill. But this can happen in our bodies as well. Sometimes you might find yourself with a little twitch that occurs, just a brief tick. And what may have happened there is that for whatever reason, just random motion, a whole bunch of stuff happened to move at just the right time to trigger some sort of muscle or nerve signal. Now, let's look at filtration. Filtration requires that there be back pressure. So if we're looking at coffee, we've got the pressure that gravity is exerting on the water to pull it through the filter. In the human body, that back pressure is blood pressure. So at the cellular level, there's no energy input that needs to be done. The kidneys use filtration to get substances out of and fluids out of the body, but it still requires that back pressure. So energy has been put in, but it's been put in at the heart. It is not occurring on the cellular level, so we still consider that a passive process. Now, active transport processes, substances that are unable to pass through diffusion, are, and there could be a variety of reasons why they are not. They could be too large. We may not be able to dissolve through the cell membrane, or we may be moving against a concentration gradient. And when I say moving against a concentration gradient, say I have over here one side of the cell, over here the other side, and I have a whole lot of potassium inside the cell. I have very little potassium outside, but I want more potassium inside the cell. So I have to make a pump that will grab hold of the potassium outside and bring it in. Because if I were just to rely on diffusion, then the high concentration in the cell would want to move outward instead of inward. This requires an output of energy. It requires ATP. And about 60% of all the energy you exert in a day occurs on this cellular level, moving stuff back and forth. Yeah, other forms of active transport we've just talked about: solute pumping. That is, we've got sodium potassium pumps that move stuff back and forth. And then we have vesicular transport, which involves bigger substances. We have exocytosis. And exocytosis is moving stuff out of a cell. The prefix exo is out. We have endocytosis, which is bringing stuff in. So the prefix endo means to bring in. Now, exocytosis works with products that our bodies make. So sweat, snot, mucus, those substances are all made inside the cell and then they are pushed outward. Well, endocytosis is used by some immune system cells. For instance, we have white blood cells, and if we have a bacteria or virus that's floating in our bloodstream, they will engulf that microorganism, pull it in, and then be able to destroy it. There's also something called pinocytosis, where we will actually take in little swallows of fluid into the cell. Now, these two processes, this active transport and passive transport, work together in our bodies. We can actively transport materials so that we've got more of it on one side of the cell. And then we talked about that facilitated diffusion where you open a doorway. Well, we can then open the doorway that will allow simple diffusion for stuff to move back to equilibrium. So we build up, we move sodium and potassium, for instance, and that puts a little electrical charge on the cell membrane. Now, we can open all those pathways, all those doorways, and the sodium moves back one way, the potassium moves the other way, and the charge on the cell membrane reverses. And that difference in charge is the key to how nerves function and how muscles function. So this is an important process. It does take a little while once we've let stuff move out to get it to move back in again. But we have ATP that's involved in moving the active transport, and then we use the passive transport. If you know who this guy is, his name is Sisyphus, and he angered the gods. And so the gods penalized him by forcing him to roll a rock up a hill all the time. He rolled the rock up the hill. When he got to the top of the hill, he let the rock go. The rock rolled back to the bottom of the hill. And our body does basically the same thing. It takes a little while to roll that rock up the hill before we can let it go. And that means that there is a delay between when one nerve signal can be activated and the next one. Same thing with muscles. We can activate a muscle, then we have to activate a different one, or we have to wait for that muscle to activate, for that charge to set up so that we can reactivate the muscle. Now, here's an example. This picture shows you we have sodium and we have potassium. And the sodium goes in, locks into this carrier, locks into the carrier changes shape, spits out the sodium, then potassium comes in, and that's all we have time for on this video. We will continue this topic on a subsequent video.